This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. The best-selling author of Lilac Girls is back with a new book out this week. Today, Where We Live, we hear from Connecticut resident and author Martha Hall Kelly. Her new book is Sunflower Sisters. It's the third and final installment following philanthropist Caroline Ferriday's family. Caroline lived in Connecticut. This book centers on three women during the Civil War: Georgeanna Woolsey, a Union nurse; Jemma, an enslaved girl; and Anne-May, a plantation mistress. Now, are you a fan of historical fiction? What questions do you have for our author, Martha Hall Kelly? You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Martha Hall Kelly is joining me on Zoom today. Martha, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you for having me.
I know the last two times you've been on the show, we've been able to speak in person, and now we've all been living in this pandemic. What has it been like for you as an author to live in this past year?
Actually, it hasn't changed my life, my writing life, that much because I live here in Litchfield, pretty isolated. I need that to be able to write, to be in that fictive dream. But two of my children have moved home with us, so that's changed things a little bit. Totally for the better. It's wonderful having them home, but I don't have quite as much privacy anymore, but it's still great.
Now, some Where We Live listeners have read Lilac Girls, which started your journey writing historical fiction based on philanthropist Caroline Ferriday and her family. I know some have also visited or heard of the Bellamy Ferriday House in Bethlehem, Connecticut. For those who aren't familiar with Caroline Ferriday, can you briefly remind us who she was?
Oh, Caroline was incredible. I fell in love with her back in 2000 when I first visited the Bellamy House and Gardens. And she was a New York socialite and a Broadway actress. And she and her family, her mother and father, she was an only child, would come up to her home here in Bethlehem, which she called the Hay, and spend every summer. And once her father passed away, sadly, from pneumonia when she was very young, she and her mother were, all they had was each other, and they became very close. And they together created the beautiful gardens that are there still today that people come to see. And they filled the garden with specimen lilacs from around the world and antique roses that still bloom today.
Mm. I mentioned Lilac Girls. This was a book that was very popular, and it told the story of how Caroline helped women who'd been imprisoned in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. You would go on to then write Lost Roses, which focused on Caroline's mother, Eliza, during World War I, or around World War I. And now we've got Sunflower Sisters, which is the story of Caroline Ferriday's great-grandmother and her 8 children. What is it about this family that's kept you going back?
Oh, they're just fascinating. I researched Caroline down in the archives at the Bellamy Ferriday House in Bethlehem for 5 years before I did anything in terms of writing a book. I actually had no intention of writing a novel, but I was just so interested in her. I felt like she had such a strong sense of right and wrong. And I was just so curious where that came from. And it turns out it came from her ancestors, the Woolsey women. And as I was researching Lilac Girls, I was reading all of these letters. There are over 100 letters, it's such a treasure to have that at the house. And they're all in archival boxes. Really, Caroline was very, very particular about her Woolsey ancestors' artifacts and all the ephemera. And she was very smart to leave her house to Connecticut Landmarks because they've taken such good care of the photographs and the letters. So when I started reading those letters, their life came alive for me. And I always knew I wanted to write a Civil War book. So this has been a dream.
Now, one of the central characters in Sunflower Sisters is Georgie Woolsey, who ends up being, again, a main character. But there's also 2 other women's stories that are weaved throughout this book. Talk about why you went that route.
Well, I always knew, and Caroline was a staunch supporter of civil rights. And when I went back and looked at the Woolseys, they were staunch abolitionists. And I knew I wanted to show that in the book. And in order to show it, I had to have an enslaved character, and her name in the book is Jemma. And I also wanted to show the horror of slavery and knew that I needed a plantation mistress. And I lived in Atlanta at the time when I first started writing it, which was great. And I got to do a lot of firsthand research down at the Atlanta History Center. They have incredible Civil War artifacts and lots of exhibits about slavery. And I also got to visit a lot of museums that were once plantations. And that was really, really helpful. I found one actually up in Maryland, and I decided to set my story in Maryland because it was a border state. And I based my plantation in the book, which is called Peeler Plantation. I based it on Sauterley, which is in Hollywood, Maryland.
Again, you're hearing Martha Hall Kelly. She's written a new book, Sunflower Sisters. You can join our conversation, especially if you're a fan of historical fiction. This book takes place during the Civil War. Here's the number to join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I think it's interesting whenever we talk about the Civil War, we obviously think about the South and the sins of slavery, the cruelty of it. But in this book, you also spend time thinking about and talking about how the North was complicit in slavery, profiting off cotton, sugar, including the Woolsey family.
Absolutely. That really surprised me when I dug into it. Mr. Woolsey, who so sadly was killed at sea in a terrible steamship accident, he had been a sugar merchant. I didn't realize that. Even when I started the book, I didn't realize it and kind of came across that. So it was really interesting that you have this family that is so anti-slavery, but he had profited off of sugar. And I think they spend their whole lives trying to kind of right that wrong.
We mentioned Georgie as one of the characters. So tell me her relation to Caroline again.
She is Caroline's great aunt. And
she
Mrs. There is a on my website a family tree, which is really helpful. It's kind of my cheat sheet. But Caroline's great grandmother, Jane Eliza, married Charles Woolsey, and they had the 8 children. And I chose Georgie, Caroline's great aunt, to write the book about because Georgie had become a nurse for the Sanitary Commission. And actually, nurse soldiers, Northern and Southern soldiers, they were very, very adamant that they would not turn away any Confederate soldier that was wounded. But she and her mom go down. That's a little bit of a spoiler for the book, but they go down to Gettysburg and nurse soldiers down there right on the battlefield. It was pretty amazing. Georgie actually wrote a book about it called 3 Weeks at Gettysburg.
And Georgie is an interesting character or woman who was unmarried until about, 28 or so? That was unusual at the time.
Very unusual. Old maid territory. Her sisters were 30, and everyone, was kind of mourning the fact that they had crossed that Rubicon to 30 and were unmarried. And they remained unmarried for the rest of their lives, but all the other girls were married. It was hard, obviously, during the Civil War because so many men were dying in battle. And it was not a time to get married. After the war, yes, but unfortunately for Abby and Jane, the 2 oldest, they never married.
So Georgie is, again, one of the main central characters. There's also Jemma. This was an enslaved girl that lived at this plantation in the book in Maryland. Talk about how you researched that character. And, there's parts in this book that are very difficult to read. And I wanted to hear more about how you brought out her story when we think about how those who were enslaved were treated.
I really wanted to show the reality of slavery, just like I felt like I did that in Lilac Girls and Lost Roses, the reality of war and, in this case, slavery. And when I visited the plantations, it's pretty obvious when you walk around there, especially the museums that do present slavery as a big part of their, when you go on a tour, that it was just a horrific way to live. And I wanted to really show that. So I read a lot of first person accounts of enslaved people, and just visited as much as I could the places where they were. Down in Charleston, there is a museum about slavery, and that's one of the first places I visited, because one of the letters that I was so moved by from the archives is about how the sisters went to visit that exact slave mart in Charleston. They stumbled upon it when they were down there just for a social visit, and they were forever changed by that, because they saw and they got to talk to. They were not allowed into the slave market, but they were allowed to stand at the gate, and they spoke with one of the enslaved people that her children were being sold. I just get so emotional even talking about it. So that was one of the things, when I went to the slave market, that is the former slave market, now a museum, I got to stand there at that same gate, and it was unbelievably moving. So I wanted to show all that, and that's how I start the book, is with that scene of them at the slave mart and seeing someone sold and their children sold as well. And it's easy to see why they were so such staunch abolitionists.
There are several more characters in Sunflower Sisters who were also enslaved, but Jemma really stands out. Tell us more about how you developed her character and the relationship that she not only builds with Georgie and the other Woolsey women, but the plantation mistress that she worked for, Anne-May.
Anne-May. I'm already getting emails from people saying, Anne-May. Yeah, I didn't want to shy away from the reality of that relationship, which it was a tricky one, the one that I show in the book between Jemma and Anne-May. Jemma was, and this is all taken from real accounts that I read about different people that were enslaved at the time. And Jemma was owned by Anne-May's Aunt Tandy Rose. And Aunt Tandy Rose taught Jemma how to read and write for her own purposes. She wanted Jemma to read to her. She wanted her to read her the Bible and novels. And so Jemma, a quick study, learned to read and write very quickly, which was against the law at the time. In Maryland, that law changed, but still it was against the law at the time to teach enslaved people to read and write. Now, Anne-May, who inherited the plantation from Aunt Tandy Rose, she could read but not write. So once Anne-May, who is from Louisiana and is a Confederate sympathizer, once she gets drawn into a kind of a spy ring, it's not a huge part of the book, but she forces Jemma to write things down for Anne-May that potentially could get Jemma into a lot of trouble, because even women back then were punished very severely for being traitors.
You mentioned that you're already getting emails about this character, Anne-May. She is the one that we all love to hate when we're reading this book. So what are people telling you?
Yes.
What have they shared with you as they're reading about her?
They just, that happens a lot. They, in my other books too, with Herta Oberhauser, people are so incensed by the way that Anne-May can be just so cruel. And I think we have to remember it's 1863. It was a different time, and it was totally accepted to feel that way about another human being, to keep someone enslaved like that, even though in the book, Aunt Tandy Rose had promised Jemma and her family that she would be freed upon her death. Anne-May has a different feeling about that and decides to keep them. So she's just a terrible piece of work. But everyone is saying that, and they all love Jemma and they love Georgie. So I think I maybe did my job there.
You mentioned Herta, so she was the Nazi in Lilac Girls, but you also spend time not just showing their evil side or the side that we love to hate, but some of the reasons why they develop that type of personality, Martha.
Absolutely. I think that's really important in a character to show both sides of it. And I think that's what made her to Oberhauser so interesting is how could she be drawn into National Socialism? And we start to see ourselves in that. Like maybe we could, given the same circumstances, be drawn into that as well. And I wanted to do the same thing with Anne-May and show her good side. And I think her brother, who marches off to war, she has a husband that goes to war and also a brother that she loves so dearly. He fights for the Confederates, and her husband Fergus goes off to fight for the Union. And so I can't really say what happens to them, but it's, I think that's a good way to show her softer side, that she loves her brother so much.
We heard from someone on Twitter who was really interested in hearing how you research your stories, and you've talked about finding these letters between the Woolsey women and traveling to certain locations like the Bellamy Ferriday House, of course, and their archives, but also going to what were once slave markets and plantations. When we think about how you develop these characters, did you know a lot about the Civil War, or during this process, Martha?
I wish I had paid attention more in high school history. I didn't love history. It's so funny in high school, for example, until I had one female history teacher who taught it from more of a female point of view. And I went to an all-girls school later in high school, and that really opened my eyes to it. But I didn't know that much about Civil War. I had seen the Ken Burns documentary and all the usual things, but I was really, my husband is a huge, huge Civil War fan. He actually was so anxious for he always reads my manuscripts, but he was so anxious for the first scenes and has been such a supporter. But I had to really get up to speed very, very quickly, especially because there's a scene from Pickett's Charge in the book, and I really, really wanted to make it authentic. And actually, Kirkus Reviews, one of the things they said about the book is that it's they compared it to a Ken Burns documentary. So that made me really happy.
You mentioned, just learning more about the Civil War. The Peeler plantation is in what was then the border state of Maryland. So there were sympathies for the Union and the Confederacy. And so when you talk about being careful not to be seen as a traitor during that time, what would happen to somebody like Anne-May if she was found out?
Well, the men would be executed, and but women, I was surprised to find out they were imprisoned. And after the war, it was the 1860s. They released them, but during the war, there were some accounts of they were tortured to find out. More of their secrets, because these women were delivering poison pies to Union troops, doing really terrible things, because the men didn't expect a woman to be capable of something like that. So, when Anne-May finds that out, that there could be, possible prison in her future, it affects her pretty badly.
Mm. When we talk more about Jemma and the relationship she builds with the Woolsey family, these are a very strict abolitionist family. How did you develop that storyline to not make it seem like they are, quote, white saviors?
I was, from day one, I was really cognizant of that. I wanted to make sure that Jemma had agency, that she wasn't a victim. And a big part of that was showing the Woolseys as, not as saviors. And I did that by making Jemma a whole person on her own. The fact that she can read and write, she's very smart about getting out of bad situations, although she's almost debilitated by some of the awful things that happened to her and her family in the book. And it's so sad. But I have her fighting back when the Woolseys, I think the Woolseys had a tendency to be very full charge. That's kind of a nice way of putting it. They were very, very smart women. And like their mother, they took over situations. And in the book, I have them trying to do that with Jemma and kind of live her life for her or tell her how she should do things. And Jemma fights back and says, hey, I am who I am and you don't have to take care of me. And I love that she does that. And readers already are telling me that they love that. Her mother, Sable, as well, fights back with Anne-May very physically in one scene it was such a catharsis to write that, where she, I can't really say what it is, but yeah. So I feel like I had to make sure that they had agency in their own right.
You're hearing Martha Hall Kelly here on Where We Live. She's a Connecticut author whose newest book is Sunflower Sisters. She also wrote the New York Times bestseller Lilac Girls. We're going to talk more with Martha after the break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about a new book out this week called Sunflower Sisters. Its author, Martha Hall Kelly, is my guest today. She wrote the New York Times bestseller, Lilac Girls. Sunflower Sisters is the story of three women during the Civil War. It's historical fiction based on relatives of philanthropist Caroline Ferriday, who once lived in Connecticut. Now, Martha, we talked about the many letters that you read and that you included in the book. Could you read an excerpt for us?
Oh, sure. Just for context, this is from a Georgie chapter, and it's from her sister Jane, who is the second oldest sister. It gets me a little bit sad, so I'll try and do my best not to get all teary, but she wrote it at the American Hotel in Litchfield, Connecticut, which when I saw that they had a connection to Litchfield, I just thought that was so interesting. Sorry, I have to take a little water. The American Hotel, Litchfield, Connecticut. Dear Georgie, as we welcome warmer days in lovely Litchfield, we follow with great interest the growth of the 19th Regiment, recruited in that county. All the little white crumbs of towns dropped in the wrinkles of the hills, sending in their 20, 30, 50 fighting men, clubbed by the very little villages, marching under our windows every day to the campground. Almost all the young men in Litchfield Village have gone. The farmers, the clerks in the shops, the singers in the choir. Who will reap next year's crops? Who is to sow them? They understood very well what they were going to. Disease, death, a common soldier's nameless grave. Your loving sister, Jane. I don't know, that just gets me every time. That all these young men were marching off to war right here from Litchfield. They all mustered at Camp Dutton. It just brings home the sadness of it, that they knew where they were going and what was going to happen.
You talk about just the sacrifices that so many make in war, including the Civil War. A part of your research was going to Gettysburg, the national battlefield that's in Pennsylvania. It was a pivotal site during the Civil War. I've been there as well, but I want you to describe this place to our listeners and what it was like to be there.
It really is hallowed ground. And not only was I able to see where Georgie had set up her actual tents, she worked with the actual hospital down there, which they set up, Camp Letterman, but they also had these satellite tents that they would set up near the train, and they would put soldiers onto the train at the train station in Gettysburg into cattle cars, which literally had just had cattle in them, and with all the, you know, dirty hay still in it, and they would set their soldiers so horribly wounded into those cars. And then, since they couldn't turn around, the train would back up all the way to Baltimore. So it was so interesting to see the actual place where Georgie and her mom set up their tents. But it also was just so moving to see Gettysburg. I had been there before when my son was very young, but going back there with this context was so moving, just to know that so many men died there, and there are so many monuments, and it was a wonderful trip. I went with my son.
Hmm. When did you start writing this book? Because we know that we've lived in quite a year, but also when we think about the conversations we're having about race and inequality, as well as gender equality, just the things that we're all reflecting on today, and how this book touches on some themes that unfortunately are still with us.
It's so funny. About 5 years ago, I started writing it, and none of that was on my radar. It really is just a coincidence that today all those things are still so relevant.
Mm. I forgot to mention the theme of nationalism. And again, as we saw the country divided over slavery and the consequences of this practice, it's just an interesting to think about when we're talking about this today, Martha. And I'm wondering, from people who've read this book, have they connected that as well? What are they sharing with you?
Absolutely. I mean, we're only 2 days in and people are already sending me emails about it. It's really interesting. I think one of the scenes in the book that is making people connect to what's happening today is the draft riots in New York City. And again, I had no idea that what happened in January at the Capitol would happen. And a lot of people are drawing a comparison to that with the draft riots, which it was a mostly Irish mob that was at first reacting, objecting to the draft, because wealthy people could spend $300 and get out of the draft. And they unfortunately were being drafted in great numbers. And but it turned into a race riot, and the longshoremen, their jobs were being taken, they felt, and I think it was partially true, by freed Black men, and they were not being conscripted to fight the former slaves. So they just created this giant insurrection and ended up murdering. Lynching 4 Black men and also a child, an 8-year-old child. So in the book, the Colored Orphan Asylum is targeted, and that is true, and it's in the Woolsey letters. And 200 children of color were evacuated from the asylum before it was burned to the ground. None of the children died, but it was traumatic. After the draft riots, a huge percent of the Black population in New York moved to Brooklyn permanently.
It's important to recall events like that, where many people probably haven't heard about that before, Martha. So thank you for explaining that to us. I was also struck by, as you're reading your book, certain prominent people who turn up, including Hartford-born Frederick Law Olmsted, who actually held an interesting position during the Civil War. Tell us about that.
He was the head of the Sanitary Commission. That was another thing I was surprised about. What a talented man. I mean, to go from designing and overseeing Central Park, the birth of Central Park, which was, especially for the time, such a feat, and overseeing the Sanitary Commission. And he was the one, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but that helps Georgie and her sister get into to become nurses. They did it on their own, but he helped them once they were eligible. he made sure that they got onto the hospital ships where he was very involved in the hospital ships. And it's one of those be careful what you wish for things, because once they were in the hospital ships, I mean, the horror of the injuries was really evident, but he was right there with them on those hospital ships.
I mentioned gender equality today. So when you're reading the book and you read the accounts that Georgie and other women, what they experienced because they were women trying to be nurses. Can you talk about that?
I think that was one of the hardest things for her. She goes on, this is another spoiler, to she and her husband create in New Haven one of the first nursing schools for women that became part of Yale. But, she experienced horrible misogyny. Before Georgie became a nurse, she was one of the very first. It was all male nurses. And they liked their kind of cushy life of not having to fight. They were the nurses on the Civil War battlefield before these women showed up. And so they were going to do anything they could to sabotage people like Georgie. But she was just, she had it together. If you were sick on the battlefield, or that's who you wanted as your nurse, because her pockets were full of every possible thing that could help. She was practically a doctor. And the doctors also were just scathing to the women, because, back then, if you had a husband or any male in your family that was wounded in battle, you went down to take care of them. So there were all these women that would show up that wanted to take care of their kin, and the doctors were just like, get these people out of here. So they were used to kind of being nasty to the women.
There's a lot of moments where your blood boils reading Sunflower Sisters. That's a good thing, Martha, because we keep turning the page.
That's conflict.
Again, I'm talking with author Martha Hall Kelly. Her new book is Sunflower Sisters. You can join us, 888-720-9677. Tom's calling in from Manchester. Tom, we just have a few minutes left. If you could be brief. Thanks.
All right, yes. Hello, Tom from Manchester. I'm of African-American background. I admired what the author's saying, and I just want to point out some things, too. In the North, you had Copperheads that were pro-South, and then about a third of Southerners did fight for the North from some of the border states, such as Tennessee. But the Confederates sometimes wouldn't take black soldiers capture afterwards. They executed them on the spot, like Fort Pillow, Tennessee, as one example. Some blacks were in the Loyal League as spies, so we did fight and earn our freedom. And I guess the Confederate thing was slavery was the point of their Constitution, and I view their flag as a flag of treason. But we should know that we fought for that war. We had 10% of the forces and 10% of the casualties. We gave our blood in the Army and Navy, so it wasn't a white man's war. And it did split the nation among ethnicities, Irish, Jewish, fought on both sides, as well as Canadian. And luckily, France and Great Britain didn't join the Confederacy, because that could have been a game changer. So it should never be forgotten. But we're all Americans today, and as I saw what happened in the White House on January 6th, should never happen, again, with that kind of racist backlash. When I saw the Confederate flag inside the White House, it really angered me. So, like I said, that's a flag of treason. I'm not apologizing for that. And they lost the war, but they got back at us in Reconstruction through racist policies till the 1960s. So I'm proud to be an African American. I'm college educated, and I pay my taxes, and I was born here and I die here. And it's good for your book to come out. I think it's timely that we need to know about it, and even discussion of reparations. So I'll end on that, and best of luck. Your book tour if you're having one. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
That was wonderful. That is. I'm so glad for that call, because that's such good background. I just want to mention that at the end of the book, Jemma's the love interest. It's a little bit of a spoiler, but involves a black regiment that comes to, I can't say too much, but that helps out. It helps Jemma save her life, really. So I'm so glad that the caller called in with that.
He also mentioned the term Copperhead. That's something that's in the book, I think in reference to Anne-May.
That's right. Anne-May is basically a Copperhead. Yeah, that was another thing I learned. So much history. But But yeah, there were lots of people living in the North that were sympathizers, and they were Copperheads.
I think that's why I enjoy your book so much, Martha. You had mentioned earlier that you were never a Civil War buff, but you're drawn to this research and using history to write these really engaging stories. And it makes people, look this stuff up, even if they don't remember the lessons, or unfortunately a lot that's not taught in public schools.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it brings out a lot of emotion. And I think it's really good. Callers like Tom and readers feel the same way. It makes it relevant again and helps us learn from history. Because if we don't learn from it, I mean, what's the point, Rhea? Don't you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I know you focused so much of your work over the last several years, these three books on the Ferriday Woolsey women. I understand this is the last one following this family, Martha?
Yes. It's really sad. My editor, Kara Caesar at Random House, we got a little teary one day on the, when she said, yeah, this is, your manuscript is perfect. Let's go. We both just kind of had a moment, because it's been, discovering Caroline and writing about her mother and now her great grandmother. It feels like, I'm leaving friends. But they'll always be there in the books, and the Bellamy Ferriday house will always be there. So, and I live 10 minutes away and do lots of events over there. So I'll be connected still. It's just, the end of an era. The book ends at the Bellamy Ferriday house. And I think that's a really nice way to bring it full circle.
I don't know, Martha. I think you could write up another book all about Jemma. What happens to her and her family?
Do you think? Ooh, there's an idea. I have two more in the hopper, though, so I have to finish those first.
So tell us about the next one a little bit.
Oh, goodness. Two more from Random House. One is a Cold War novel, and that takes place in the 1950s. And it's connected to Ravensbrück. It's kind of connected to Lilac Girls. And it's two women, one American, half Jewish, and one friends who survived Ravensbrück, but terrible things were done to them there by this one doctor that they hunt down after. And they go all around the world, from Paris and Rome to South America. So that's really fun. That's called The Golden Doves. And the next one after that takes place in my house in Litchfield. I have thinly disguised it. It's in Liberty, Massachusetts, but it actually takes place in Litchfield. So that's been fun, writing about my own town. But it's also it's a thriller, a current day thriller. And my husband says we may have to move, though, from this house because I've scared myself too badly writing about writing scenes in this house, and it's a scary, scary book. But so those two I'm having a lot of fun writing those.
Well, we can't wait to read them. Martha Hall Kelly, thank you so much for your time. I'm just curious, with these books and the following of the Ferriday Woolsey women, any plans on making this the next TV series on Netflix or Hulu?
Wouldn't that be great? There may be some things in the hopper. Lilac Girls had been optioned, and that unfortunately didn't go anywhere, but you never know. I think maybe Sunflower Sisters, third time's the charm.
Well, wonderful. I can't wait to hear more. Martha, it's a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy.
That's Martha Hall Kelly, author of the new book, Sunflower Sisters. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talk to Connecticut Landmarks, which, like most nonprofits, has had a rough year because of the pandemic. Connecticut Landmarks operates more than a dozen historical homes around our state, including the Bellamy Ferriday House and Garden in Bethlehem. We'll find out more after the break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Joining me now on Zoom is Aaron Markovich, Executive Director with Connecticut Landmarks. This is the network of 11 historic properties in our state, including the Bellamy Ferriday House in Bethlehem. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
So what has it been like this last year in the pandemic for your organization?
Well, we're an organization that's been around since the 30s, and we've gone through a lot of things over the years. But the last year was, of course, a bit of a struggle. We had about a 60% loss in income, but we did reopen sort of July, August of last year. Met with a lot of great enthusiasm from visitors who were eager to get out of the house and explore safely. And we opened for different types of tours and events, of course, following all the state guidelines. A place like Bellamy Ferriday, which everybody just heard about, had about a limit of 15 people in the tours. And we had to reduce that to 5 during the coronavirus restrictions. But we continue to hold a variety of virtual programs and had a lot of support from all of our fans and visitors.
A 60% drop in revenue. That seems pretty challenging when also you think about these historic homes. It costs a lot of money to maintain them.
It sure does. It sure does. And that was 60%. That encompasses our earned income, which is our rentals, our walk-in tours, and those types of things. So we are retooling to be able to be more accommodating there. This year, we're really looking forward. We've got basically a full rental schedule for weddings coming up in the at the Hale Homestead. We own the Nathan Hale Homestead and some of our other sites, and we're starting to reopen. So starting May 1st, Bellamy Ferriday will be open for tours by appointment Wednesdays through Sunday, 12 to 4. So we hope to see people coming out to those sites and all of our sites.
Oh, that's good news. And especially with the Bellamy Ferriday House, the beautiful gardens that Caroline Ferriday and her staff maintain there, to see the lilacs blooming and the peonies. It's so special, Aaron.
It is absolutely. Our site administrator, Peg, out there and all the staff does an amazing job and keeps those grounds looking amazing. We have a lilac week that will be when the lilacs come into bloom and are really just a very special time to be out there. And we work very closely with the Bethlehem Land Trust that owns the next door property. It was all part of the Bellamy Ferriday property, and the land trust has a great walking trail up through the woods and grounds that surround the property.
I'm going to put a plug in for the Phelps Hathaway House in Suffield, another beautiful historic home and garden that's part of the landmarks, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. Phelps Hathaway is fantastic. If folks have not been to the main street of Suffield, I really encourage you to get out there. In addition to the Phelps House and that visitation, they're going to be opening a little bit later than Bellamy, but you've got a great walk down Main Street. The gardens are beautiful, and we're really looking forward this year to putting a little bit more investment into that site and building up our opportunity to have it available for rentals and for educational programs. Just really, there are 12 sites around the state that are just, each of them are different types of stars. Everything from their colonial history at the Nathan Hale Homestead to the Bellamy House and the stories around both Reverend Bellamy, who was a leader of the religious movement in the 1700s called the Great Awakening, and actually had Aaron Burr live at the house for a very short period of time, all the way to places in Hartford, such as the Isham Terry House, which is a unique site that we're working hard to get reopened on a more regular basis.
I'm glad you mentioned the Nathan Hale Homestead a couple of times. It's a beautiful property. I actually went there for a ghost tour before the pandemic, Aaron. What would you say is your favorite landmark within the organization? Are you allowed to pick favorites?
You're not allowed to pick your favorite child, so I won't pick a favorite house either. I really do enjoy the story that happens down at our New London site, the Hempstead Houses. That has a really unique connection with an enslaved person named Adam Jackson. And we're really working hard. We've been working with a group called the International Coalition on the Sites of Conscience, and to really bring those interesting, exciting stories out. Martha was talking about getting emotional when she heard these stories and visiting these places. History has like a really great way to connect people to that emotion and those complex things. In history, you talked a little bit about the fact that we were kind of forced into memorizing dates and times instead of embracing stories and how they can be transformative to us. Historic sites are that very tangible experience. And when you go to the Hempstead houses, as an example, you make that connection. The Hale homestead or Phelps or whatever they might be, these houses that we operate, you get to connect directly to them.
And where are the Hempstead houses located? And tell us a little bit more about some of the notable figures there that focus on the diverse people that once lived there.
Yeah, the Hempstead houses are located more or less just on the edge of downtown New London, and we love New London, and we're embracing our work with them. And so in this case, Joshua Hempstead, he's sometimes known as the diarist. He kept a diary, and in that diary, he would remark on Adam's life. And you didn't get necessarily deep into the emotion that Adam might have been feeling, but you got a sense of the rhythm of his life, the ups and the downs and the things that he was doing and the work that he was doing. And it is really just a unique thing. And we've installed now a new exhibit piece that will be open later this year that is essentially a touchscreen diary so that you can see these words brought to life. The Historical Society in New London owns the actual diary. And so we continue to work together. It's really exciting to do that. In addition, we've been working, you mentioned the Phelps house. Oliver Phelps was one of the richest men in the world at the time that he lived in the Phelps house in Suffield, but he had a very bad record in dealing with Native Americans and his treatment of them. So history's complex. There's no easy, clean stories here. So we're working hard to try to interpret those and work with partners to do that.
And you mentioned Adam again at the Hempstead house, so he was someone who was enslaved there.
Yes, exactly. And there were other enslaved people, but Adam was a person who had a little bit more in Joshua's diaries, and that's the lens that we're able to see Adam in his life.
Well, there's definitely plenty of the properties within the Connecticut Landmarks that residents should check out, and hopefully more tourists that come into our state as we are all looking for the end of this pandemic. Aaron, before we let you go, we just spoke to Martha Hall Kelly, and there's an event happening related to the Bellamy Ferriday House and her latest book. Can you tell us briefly?
That's right. We have a virtual fundraising event on Sunday, April 18th at 3 p.m. That's April 18th at 3 p.m. if you're writing that down at home. Benefits Connecticut Landmarks. It will be presented via Zoom, include a slideshow of images from Bellamy Ferriday, as well as a question and answer after Martha's program with site administrator Peg Scheimer and our Hartford Properties administrator and sort of internal historian in many ways, Janet Colosino. It's actually free. You just have to register for the base level. But if you contribute, we suggest a donation of $10. But if you are willing to contribute $25, you get some free admission tickets. And if you're willing to contribute $75, we'll actually send you a signed Sunflower Sisters hardcover book, keepsake, 2 passes, a commemorative bookmark, and of course, a portion of that will be tax deductible. And we just tell people that in addition to that event, we have walking tours in Hartford, sunset sounds, tours, lectures, our Juneteenth program at Hempstead, our annual encampment.
It all sounds great, Aaron Markovich. We have a link on our website, WNPR.org/where we live for more. Thank you so much, Aaron Markovich, Executive Director with Connecticut Landmarks. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our theme music composed by Hannes Brown. We hope you have a great weekend.